Hi everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar hosted by Buzzacott and with Oliver from the Employee Ownership Association as our guest speaker today. Today's webinar is on succession planning with a spotlight on employee ownership. Just a few housekeeping things to start with. This webinar is being recorded. If you have joined anonymously and would like a copy of the recording to be emailed to you, please just drop your email address in the chat. Only ourselves will see that information. And also just a reminder, there will be a Q&A session at the end of this. So please, as we go through, post your questions and we'll be pleased to answer as many as we have time for today. Just to start off by introducing ourselves as speakers today. My name's Mira. I work in the corporate finance team at Buzzacott, helping entrepreneurs build and realise value over the course of their journey, and succession planning being one of those key elements during their time growing their businesses. We've also got Anna Louise, who's also in my team at Buzzacott.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm also a lead advisor in the corporate finance team at Buzzacott. I also help clients with a range of succession options, but have specialism in employee ownership, so we'll be taking you through the technical areas of that particularly today.
And then introducing you to Oliver from the Employee Ownership Association. Hi, Oliver.
Morning everybody. My name's Oliver Smith. I'm from the Employee Ownership Association. I'm the head of membership. Our role as an organisation is to support businesses to become employee owned, and once they are employee owned, what does it mean? How do you make the most of it? Which I'll be explaining more about fairly shortly.
Fantastic. So I think if we can talk through the agenda today, what we've sort of got planned. We'll start with an introduction to Buzzacott and the EOA, for those of you that aren't familiar with our organisations, and then we'll keep that brief because we'll get into the kind of chunk of what we want to talk about today. Succession planning, which I'll be covering in terms of what it is, why it's important, what you should be thinking about, and some of the different options you have for succession. And Louise will then be kicking us off on our specialist topic today, talking about some of the technical areas. What does an employee ownership trust actually look like, and then with Oliver covering the cultural aspects of it and going into depth on that in more detail. We'll then do a kind of roundup on the key elements we've discussed before moving on to the Q&A at the end. So I think without further ado, let's crack on with the formal introductions of the organisation. So if we just to give you guys, for those of you who haven't sort of heard about Buzzacott before, we're a top 25 accountancy firm for helping clients for over 100 years, all based prior to lockdown in one office in London, St Paul's, and our kind of departments and specialisms span three broad areas: corporate, private clients, and then charities and not-for-profits, which is where the kind of history of the firm has come from. And we're of that kind of, I'd say, perfect size in the fact that we're big enough that we've got all these specialisms under one roof, that sort of still have that personal touch which you get from a smaller firm. In terms of our corporate finance team specifically, so we sit within the corporate team. There are 13 of us today. We've been growing since our start at Buzzacott for over 5 years, and at the crux of it, we're just committed to helping entrepreneurs build and realise value over the long term, and whatever form that might take. So just to give you guys an example, over the last sort of 3-4 months, we've been a couple of things we've been helping clients on. So a job board software company that we sold to a US publishing house. We have been working together with one of our clients who's sort of, I'd say, halfway through their journey, wanting to realise some value, looking ahead to a future exit, working with a private equity firm on that side of things. That's a media company. And then we've got a growth capital raised for £3 million that we helped our client close earlier this year. So just a number of things that we've closed, but working very much with our client closely, always to help on the planning side of things, whether that's sort of for tomorrow or for 5 years time, and I'll touch on that a bit more with my section later on. If I then hand over to Oliver to give a bit more of an introduction on the EOA.
Thanks, Mira. So yeah, the Employee Ownership Association, we've been going for 41 years. We operate as a membership organisation, so about 430 businesses are members of the EOA. Our bigger picture objectives are around inspiring, campaigning, lobbying for more employee ownership in the UK, and we do that quite successfully. We're across all political parties, key stakeholders such as the ICAW, Law Society, because we see these organisations as the key to raising greater levels of awareness amongst employee ownership. As you will, because you've joined this webinar, you'll know there's more organisations in the UK that are employee owned than just John Lewis, which historically a few years ago was the spokes brand, shall we say, for employee ownership in the UK, but there are far more, which I'll detail a little bit more in a bit. So how we operate, we have all these members of the association. They come to us at different stages. So if they're thinking about employee ownership, they come to us and join, and we help them understand what that means. We work alongside advisors like Buzzacott to complement their technical work, and we help them understand what it's like to become employee owned and that journey, that significant journey they're going to go on. And we connect people, quite simply. We connect them with others that have been there and done it, and it allows you as business owners that are thinking about this to understand what the process might be, and to go through a journey that's easier to understand and more successful potentially. So we do it. We've used to do a lot of events, but we've moved all that online, and we connect people in different ways, and it's an opportunity for all employees of part of organisations to access that support. And I'll share some more details with you about employee ownership fairly shortly. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks, Oliver. And so I think if we dive into succession planning now, so I think if we start at the beginning, what is succession planning, and why is it important? Succession planning, fairly self-explanatory in the words itself. It is planning for succession. There are a number of factors to consider when you're thinking about what your business might look like in the future. And I think often for entrepreneurs, when you've got so much on your plate, thinking about today and the medium term of how you're going to continue growing, one of the things that sort of often slips by until later on is thinking about that longer term. If you've just gone through your, say, first fundraising round, your Series A, actually it might be that if you're not thinking, if you're thinking about a Series B, it might be your exit comes after that, and that might be sort of sooner than you might think. Equally, something that we like to sort of discuss with our clients is you never know when an opportunity might also come to you. So we've had many clients that we've helped out who have said, actually, I wasn't particularly thinking of exiting today or this year, maybe in a year or two, but actually a really great offer has just come across to me from a competitor, and maybe I should be considering it. And even if it's not that offer that you say take up, you might want to be better prepared for when the next one comes along and someone says to you, can we have a conversation? What information do you have available to you? So I think the message we'd like to get across is, it's never too early to start planning. I've got a few statistics on the slide there. Just under half of UK businesses have a succession plan, which, if you think how quickly businesses are growing and M&A activity in the UK and abroad, actually that's quite a low percentage, and particularly for the family-owned businesses who may want to keep that legacy in the business. With only 20% of those making it to the third generation within the family, and actually, in the more extreme but worst case is if there wasn't, no plan in place, a third of business closures are estimated to be caused by a failure of effective succession planning, trying to sort of scramble at the last minute is often, you know, not an ideal outcome. So I've put a few sort of key words there in terms of factors that we discuss with our clients and things you should start talking about, you know, as shareholders, as management teams, and bouncing across, you know, ideas with your peers, with advisors, with the EOA, if employee ownership is something you're considering, because, you know, there's things like maximizing value. So there's the sort of core financial side of things, but there are a whole host of other things like, you know, what's the legacy, what's the culture you want to leave, you know, thinking about your employees. You've worked so hard to build up this business, you know, you want to really hope that you leave it in the hands of somebody who can kind of see your vision through, or a vision that you agree with, and are happy to see someone take across. And I think, you know, timeline is important, but because these things can move faster than we'd imagine. But I think if we kind of move on to the next slide, just wanted to cover, you know, when we're talking about succession, what are our options? And we've just sort of summarised three here. There are partial versions of each if you're looking to realise value along the way, but this is more thinking about kind of an eventual exit. So trade sale to start with, you know, this is a sale effectively to a competitor or a private equity house, and those two in themselves are very different things. You know, but if you kind of going through sort of pros and cons here. So on the pros side, trade sales do, compared to the other options, tend to give you the highest exit value and best sort of financial stability, thinking about the long term. And going back to those factors that you would have been weighing up, you know, legacy, value, and maximizing that, actually, if in priority terms, you know, you actually think an exit value and maximizing that is your greatest priority, then perhaps a trade sale might be more up your street. But equally, on the sort of con side of things, the culture and the legacy could be negatively impacted. You don't necessarily have that kind of control later on down the line. And something that we've found helpful and in exploring this option is when you're thinking about a trade sale, we've seen this before with some of the trade sales, particularly to US businesses, as we've seen that be quite popular, looking to get a kind of a footprint in the UK, is because you never sort of know who your potential purchaser might be. Building those relationships early on and building up your network is really important. And so, you know, it might be at a trade show or at, you know, other events where you're sort of bumping into, at the moment virtually, but, you know, you're bumping into your competitors, your peers. And it's never a bad thing to sort of keep each other in the loop on sort of what your plans are without, you know, giving away your secrets. But I think it's really important, because you might say something to them, you know, I'm considering seeing how technology might play a part in a particular part of my business and growing that product or service, for example, and that might sort of pique their interest, so that in a few years' time, when actually they were thinking about expanding in the UK, they might come and knock on your door and say, actually, it was really interesting what you talked about, and you'll sort of stick in their mind. On the private equity side, I think that is often a very different sort of legacy and exit route there, but important to understand what that actually means. And many of the private equity houses that we work with are very happy to kind of have a you know, sort of no commitment and non-confidential chats with you, just so that, I think often private equity feels a very sort of big, scary private equity house sort of coming in and taking over my business. You know, there's a whole host of private equity firms on the sort of spectrum, but many of those we work with at the SME side of businesses in the UK, you know, that they are happy to have a chat so you can understand what value they might bring. So I think those things in terms of building the relationships are really important for a trade sale option. Thinking then to a management buyout, and this is effectively the purchase of shares by you know, other existing shareholders, or typically it's you know, management team. Where this works really well is where you've got a management team, you know, second tier management team you can actually see taking on the business. You know, they've already got a really significant role in managing the business. And actually this can work really well because they know your business best. You know, they're effectively running it alongside with you, and ultimately it leads to kind of a smoother transaction. I think where the difficulties arise is either perhaps not having that management team in place. That again goes to, you know, looking ahead in any and really what succession planning is all about. Because if you start thinking about even initially, you know, who might be the sort of people that might take over my business going forward, and sort of mapping out with them taking on extra responsibility, etc., as you move through the years of growing as a business, is really important, so that if you do get to a point of starting to think about an exit, you have a management team kind of ready and waiting if you wanted to explore an MBO. It can be sometimes difficult, I think, in terms of value expectations being different. So obviously for those selling, you know, they'd want to be potentially maximising on their value they're getting for what they've built up to date. But the management team aren't sort of getting anything on day one beyond the stake, and what they'll actually be doing often is taking on debt in order to fund that management buyout, as well as putting in some money typically themselves. So there can sometimes be sort of a difficulty in managing that. That's often where, when we're helping on a management buyout, our role comes in sort of liaising with all parties to just marry up where expectations might differ. And then I think just kind of the final option there on employee ownership trusts, and I'll leave this to Anne-Louise to cover in more detail in a moment. I think that can be where it works really well is, you know, the legacy and the culture are retained. You are incentivizing your entire employee base to continue on what, you know, you've started, and continue on that journey. I think where it doesn't work in sort of contrasting it with the trade sale, for example, is you won't necessarily get kind of, as the departing shareholder, your value realised sort of quite quickly and in a short period of time. So if that again is a concern, then perhaps that isn't for you. But there are so many benefits to an employee ownership trust that I'm pleased we'll be going through in a moment. And hopefully that gives you guys a kind of an overview of the different key options then, and happy to field questions later on about some of those. But let me just hand over at this time to Anne-Louise to run you through an employee ownership.
Thanks, Mira. That's really helpful. I think as Mira sort of nicely set out there, so employee ownership trusts are an alternative solution to MBOs and trade sales, and while they can function similarly to perhaps an MBO, they also offer some great alternatives, particularly in terms of the culture and the legacy. And I think there is probably a lack of understanding of employee ownership trusts, and actually when you're talking to advisors about succession planning, it's an option that doesn't always come up, and it's not the right option for absolutely everybody, but it does work for people, and it's really important to understand is in that sort of repertoire of options for you. So coming back to basics, in the 2013 budget, the government introduced employee ownership trusts to incentivise indirect ownership of companies by employees. The employee ownership trust is just a wrapper for a corporate finance transaction. So all the normal transactional rules still apply in this circumstance, but there are, as we touched on, different cultural things which come into play as well. So an employee ownership trust is a trust that holds the shares of the company on behalf of its employees. So the way it operates, as you can see in the diagram, Amy, I don't know if that's on screen now, is the exiting shareholders sell a majority stake in the business to the employee ownership trust. So that's at least 50.1%. On that basis, they receive a tax benefit. So those shares are sold at 0% tax. And while this is a great motivator for people to do employee ownership transactions, there are a lot of other considerations to be made, and it shouldn't solely be made on the basis of a tax break. The employee ownership trust, as I mentioned, then holds the shares on behalf of the employees who become the beneficiaries of the trust. Sometimes there is an injection of third-party funding, so a bank might be involved to help the upfront transaction. So the initial sum that's paid out might be funded by a third party. That is the only third party that would be involved in the transaction. Otherwise, it is an internal transaction that happens. So that's where one of the areas where it does differ. You don't have two sides in the same way as you would with a trade sale. When you're creating a trust, it is an internal transaction that happens. So in a trust, all the current and future employees of the trust will be beneficiaries of it. So they will be entitled to profits of that trust in the future. So whereas previously shareholders would have got dividends and benefited from profits that way, the beneficiaries of the trust will get distributions, and there are tax breaks on these distributions as well. The trust is managed by trustees who act in the interests of the beneficiaries. The trustees are separate from the directors, so the directors will continue to run the business and make the day-to-day decisions, but the trustees will have an overarching view of the business and can therefore sort of block decisions or have an influence over decisions. So, for example, if the directors decided they wanted to move the business from one location to the other, and actually all the employees were based in the original location, the trustees could block that decision because it's not in the interest of the employees. Considerations to make are, if you only make a partial sale, so if you did sell 50.1% to become eligible for it and later decided to sell the remaining 49.9%, you wouldn't then be eligible for further tax breaks. That's only available on the first instance. Outgoing shareholders can be trustees. Ideally not always, because it's a good shift in culture, and always like to have an employee as a trustee to really feel the representation of the employees in the trust. Trustees can hold the position permanently or can be rotated through. So yes, it's really about long-term engagement. So the employees will benefit from the business and feel real impact from the profitability of the business. So feel a long-term commitment to the goals, and it can create a really congruent employee base. So it can also be a recruitment tool, because if you have a normal business where the shareholders are benefiting from the profits of the company, or an employee-owned business where actually all the employees are benefiting from the profits of the company, obviously that can be quite a persuasive argument. But also there's a greater cultural element where everyone feels a level of engagement and involvement with the business and feels like they have their say in what goes on, because they can genuinely influence what happens, whether that be through employee councils which feed into the trustees, or whether they become an employee trustee themselves. So as I sort of touched on earlier, the employees can benefit from tax exemptions. So on those distributions, they can have sort of bonuses up to £3,600 tax-free. And some of the downfalls that we haven't touched on is this is a long-term solution. This isn't sort of you sell into a trust and then it's sold out of the trust again as a trade sale. It is quite difficult to do that. I think this is a legacy decision. So once it's sold into the trust, we do see that as a more permanent outcome. If you do sell on at a later date, the proceeds of that sale the proceeds of the sale that relate to the trust element would be paid out to the employees. So would be charged at income tax rates, not capital gains tax rates or entrepreneurs relief rates. Therefore, to make it worthwhile, it has to be quite a huge valuation at a later sale to make that work. So really, if you're going to transition to an employee ownership trust, it should be a sort of a permanent thought process rather than a temporary solution. We'll move on. Yeah. So if we assume that a business transitions into employee ownership trust, and the business generates £1.5 million of profit after tax, if we do 100% sale, and I say this is the sort of purist route where really the culture is all aligned because the business becomes fully employee owned, the full distribution would be available for the trust to distribute between the company's employees. Under I said 50% sale, would be 50.1% because it must be a majority to be eligible. The first half would be sort of paid from the trust out to the employees if the trust thinks that's sensible. So the distribution would work at 50% of the total profits, and the remaining 50% would be paid out to the remaining shareholders as a dividend. So that's sort of a very brief overview of the technical considerations we have as part of an employee ownership trust. Later, I'll go into more detail around the cultural considerations and how transactionally it can look a little bit different and the other factors you have to consider. But I think I'll hand over to Oliver at this point so he can feed into how this looks as part of the Employee Ownership Association.
Thanks, Anna Louise. Yeah, so my piece with you now is to tell you a little bit more and give you a flavour of what the EO sector looks like. So you'll see there hashtag EO is the answer. It's a theme that we're adopting this year for EO Day, Employee Ownership Day, which is on Friday this week. EO Day, just to tell you, is an annual event that celebrates employee ownership. It's got great levels of success and it grows year on year in terms of its penetration and noise making because of the number of employee-owned businesses that grow year on year. And we picked this quite bold theme because we believe that EO can potentially be the answer and in all different types of questions. So if we looked at the current challenges that many businesses are facing right now over the past few months and what COVID-19 has brought, where we're seeing successes is where businesses can be resilient, where their levels of productivity can retain and not drop to significant or dangerous levels, where their status and their increased financial performance is such that they can keep going. Yes, taking advantage of government scheme, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. And EO is the answer to that because of the levels of empowerment that the employees can have working in an employee-owned business. It's culturally, as Anna Louise pointed to there, it's so significant and the impact can be so significant. And as we speak to our members that are going through exactly the same challenges that the UK economy is facing, because employee-owned businesses spread the various sectors of the UK economy from professional services to manufacturing, they're citing all the same challenges. They're going through all the same issues, but they have that greater level of resilience because they're employee-owned and they've got to the point of their employees feeling like they own the business. So if you're listening to this and you own your business, you know what passion and drive you have for it. What employee ownership can create is, to an extent, the same passion and drive in the whole of the workforce. And that's why we feel EO is potentially the answer. And the answer for you, if employee ownership could be an option for you, legacy has been mentioned, which is a key word. So you've built up a business over a number of years. You're listening to this webinar probably because you don't just want to disappear into the sunset and wonder what might happen to it. You're interested in the future of the organisation and the future of the employees. Employee ownership allows you to do that. And it also allows you to reward those employees as those financial incentives that was mentioned, but also that empowerment to feel like you're committed towards the organisation and you own it as well. And something that was mentioned earlier on that as a con, but it also could actually be a benefit. You may not realise your full financial potential from the profit of your sale once moving the business to employee ownership, but instead that could be gleaned over a number of years if you did it via vendor loan. But it does allow you, if you wish, to stay in the business. If you want to create the legacy, you can continue to create that legacy by staying around and adding your input and influence. So your exit can be over a period of time rather than just one foul swoop if it was a trade sale. So on the next slide, I just want to share with you and evidence the cultural aspect that many of our members are sharing with us right now. So it's the strength through the crisis. These are some of the quotes that people have provided us. So strength through the crisis, how they've managed to engage the workforce during the challenges of the past 3 months. Yes, people have gone digital, but it doesn't just mean that you stop talking to them. Rather, it's how you communicate with the employees and the messages that you're giving and the data that you're sharing with them that then empowers the staff to feel, okay, I might be furloughed for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whenever it may be, but I'm still engaged in what the business is doing. I've still got a level of commitment towards it. And if you look to the bottom left, why at my business, I feel like we're all in it together. And that's the opportunity that employee ownership can make when you look at that cultural aspect and the impact it can have, because it unites the workforce behind a common purpose, because you are all in it together. You all want the business to survive and thrive because you're employee owned, because you're an owner, and you want to create that legacy yourself. So on the next slide, just to demonstrate some sector statistics to you. So the sector's grown year on year, and it continues to do so. We've seen its largest growth over the past 12 months, and that growth comes about because of the campaigning and awareness activity that the EOA has been at the forefront of making. So more and more advisors are coming to the market that have employee ownership as a viable option for you as a client. The more your interest will grow, and the more the sector will grow. The media coverage. We've seen big moves such as Richer Sounds, Aardman Animations, but also, to be honest, it can be those smaller SME businesses that are relevant to you, where you recognise the similarities. So it might be regional trade press, it might be a conversation that you have at a networking event that says that you recognise employee ownership could work for me because it worked for them. There might be a competitor, but I can see there is a similar size business. So more than 100 businesses became employee owned over the past 12 months, which is the greatest level of growth over the 12-month period. And we estimate there's now 470 employee owned businesses in the UK. Some of you might sit there thinking, well, 470 is not many of the hundreds of thousands of businesses that are employee owned, but I can assure you that's significant growth, and that's growing year on year, and that will continue to grow because of the level of resilience that employee owned businesses have. And all it takes really is just increased levels of awareness as this as a viable option towards the business. And you know, some further statistics, the top 50, so the biggest UK employee-owned businesses, it continues to be strong. So combined sales are up, productivity's up, and a significant stat that 66% of those businesses have no debt. That's a key element of employee ownership as well. So what this demonstrates, what the message that I'm trying to get across is, it's a viable option. It's a really niche sector, and it creates those niche advantages for you that Anna Louise mentioned as well, around recruitment, also around retention. There are many benefits to consider. It's not a panacea. It's not going to work for everybody, but it's certainly a sector that's growing. It's got legs. It will continue to grow. We just need more organisations to really explore the opportunity that this might provide for each businesses in the UK.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Oliver. I think I'll go straight on to exploring a little more depth whether employee ownership trust could be the right succession option for you. So just developing on points that Oliver and I have already raised. So yeah, as we mentioned, it is a cultural decision, and it's not just for the tax breaks. There are other sort of considerations to make when you move into an employee ownership trust. There's greater transparency in the business than you'd experience in a usual corporate structure. So financial records, salaries, those sorts of things are all visible by the trustees and have to be justifiable. So I think that the openness and the incorporation of all the people in the business, for some people makes complete sense, and it's, you know, this is already how we've been working. For others, it can be a bit jarring and a bit unsettling to have to be more open with the information they have in the business. As we touched on previously around the value, shareholders are unlikely to be able to realise value immediately. So you might be able to take on third-party funding to take out an initial lump sum. There's very likely, even if you do that, you will have an element of deferred payment, which will happen over several years to fully realise your value. Also, you're unlikely to be able to realise as much as you do through a trade sale. If you have dreams of this trade sale with mega multiples and sort of serendipity, and you just happen to find the perfect buyer and get that dream valuation, that's not what's going to happen with employee ownership trust. It's got to be a justifiable valuation. It's got to be a valuation that the business can afford to pay. there's no point having a great valuation and then the business is laboured under huge payments to the exiting shareholders for the next however many years. That's not going to motivate the employees left behind, and it's also not going to be viable for the business. One of the key principles is that the employee group are engaged and interested in the long term, and part of that needs to be a real transition. So we do tend to try and limit these deferred payments on transactions, because if all the money is still going out to the exiting shareholders, the employees aren't feeling the financial benefits, at least in the short term. One of the challenges we have seen, particularly with the younger generation, careers tend to be more transient. Now people change jobs more frequently than they did years ago, and the long-term commitment to the goals of a company, while they're absolutely there, and I have mentioned previously, there are key drivers in recruitment because people do believe in this. There are others who are not committed to the long-term goals of the company, so this isn't a huge advantage, or they don't want to see it through the deferred payment period to get the benefits in a few years' time. I have had several conversations with people saying, oh, look, I can dispose of my shares at 0% tax. This sounds brilliant. Yes, it is brilliant, but it's only brilliant with everything else that goes along with it. That cannot be the sole reason for becoming an employee ownership trust. And I think really when you understand it better, it will fall down in other areas. Like I mentioned, the transparency, the inability to get all the cash out right away. There's lots of other elements that feed in to mean that employee ownership might be the right option, but the tax driver is not the main reason. And as you understand the transaction more fully, I think that becomes quite clear. And actually, I don't know, Mira, if you want to touch on this, we've got a couple of case studies when it's been done for the right reasons and the wrong reasons. I previously worked with Orms, who sold into an employee trust in 2018, and they've been hugely successful. It fitted brilliantly with the culture of the business, and they've seen great employee engagement and great performance of the company overall.
As Anna said, the businesses that we've helped, such as Orms, have, the balance was right. The financial arrangements and the sort of culture and plans for that business work so well that they've continued to thrive, and sadly that there are others who aren't. So I think this can work so well for so many businesses, but if it doesn't, it really can be pretty bad and fall into the kind of when everything kind of crashes, of not almost equivalent to if you didn't have a plan in the first place, but you've now had a business with debt on it, with employees who are now faced without that legacy and without that future, what they sort of bought into, planning wise. So I think that's
the right reason, isn't it?
Exactly. I think there's been some questions around debt. Hopefully that kind of helps to cover some of that out, what we just spoke about. I don't know if there was anything else before we did touch on. We've had a couple of questions through before we touch on Q&A. If there's anything else you guys wanted to cover.
I mean, there's plenty more we could cover, but I think actually looking at some of these questions that you said, there is one on debt, which I think I might go into now, if that's okay. So I've had one that says, please can you talk through the debt in the company, given the highly uncertain business environment, is there a risk that the overburdening of a company with debt in order to fully buy out current shareholders could really harm the business's ability to grow, which in turn is required to buy the owners out? And absolutely, that is a risk. When we assist with employee ownership transactions, one of the key pieces of work we do is modelling the transaction, how it looks and how the deferred payments look, how long is the tail. We have done transactions without any third-party debt taken on, and the tail is just a bit longer. And we've had transactions where there is debt taken on, but it's got to be affordable for the company. It cannot be, well, we advise that it cannot be putting the company in a delicate position, because the risk is actually you don't end up getting your money out at all because the company does go under. We try, like I said earlier, we try to not have the tail too long, because it can demotivate the employees, but it's got to be thought of in the context of the whole business and actually be affordable for the company. Because if you're running the company on the basis of debt covenants or make payments, that's not a comfortable, fun way to run a company either, and that's not going to have good employee engagement.
And I think that's where doing something in part of advising companies who are looking at employee ownership and indeed different debt options or whatever it might be, where forecasting and modelling comes into its own. It's often a sort of more a boring thing for us accountants and Excel lovers to look at, but this is kind of the crux of why it is useful. So you can actually map out to say, okay, this is our growth plan, what does that look like? And talking with you to say, okay, this is the vision we're taking our business in, continues taking the business into, and what growth might look like financially, under potentially different scenarios as well, because I think the very valid question there around touching on uncertain business environment. We do completely appreciate and understand today it's not just a case of here's our growth plan and near enough we'll kind of hit that along the way. There is some uncertainty at the moment, and I think it's getting the kind of balance right with different scenarios, model out so that everyone involved in this transaction can really see what that looks like. If we take on this level of debt, what are repayments and how does that map with, say, our worst case scenario, recovering from coronavirus impacting our business. And I think it's working together with you on that before we're sort of in conjunction, I guess, with speaking to banks and understanding what level of lending they might be able to provide.
Just a technical point to pick up with in terms of the liability of the trust to pay the exiting shareholders. There's not a contractual obligation in the same way. It's based on the ability of the company to pay. So when you have a trust deed written, you might set a figure that is supposed to be paid every year. But if the money's not there in the company, the shareholders can't legally go after the trust for that money, which can again make exiting shareholders uncomfortable because there's not sort of legal recourse there to protect their payments. However, if the money is there, it can continue to be paid out. So there is a kinder sort of attitude towards the company in that circumstance. That's obviously if you have exiting shareholders, not a bank. The bank works quite differently. Also, the bank would have priority over any additional payments to exiting shareholders. They wouldn't be paid out before the bank's paid. So that's something to take into consideration as well.
Just to bring a point here as well, I think on the topic of debt, it's naturally going to be of high interest to people selling a business and obviously what's going to happen next. I think there are many case studies where a vendor loan has been put in place that has just worked successfully. So the apprehension I can completely understand from people around that, but I think and all businesses are different, but by listening to others and feeling the experiences that other organisations have been to, where a vendor loan's been put in place that might be paid off over 3 or 4 or 5 years, there can be uncertainty of what that's going to feel like. Actually going to speaking to people who've been through that process and that experience, they can really hear the case studies and the real life experiences that are in fact very positive. That it may be structured over a 3 or 4 year period, but with their continued involvement, with the motivation and empowerment of the employees, that debt can be paid off quicker than 3 or 4 years. So if the trust is in a position to do so, it can pay off the debt quicker. I think there are many positive case studies out there that people should potentially tap into, because debt is naturally a topic of concern. But as we speak to people that inquire with us, it doesn't need to be such a concern to them.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I think we've had another question through around employees still receiving sort of distributions while there's a tail. That there can still be distributions. It's just these will be capped to a certain level, so there'll be a lot of profit still going out to the exiting shareholders. It's not that you'd max out every year before the deferred tail is fully paid off. Once the tail is fully paid off, there's obviously a huge amount more profit available to distribute to employees, so the benefits are much more strongly felt.
And just on that topic as well, I can just add in, it's worth noting, just from experience of speaking to many businesses, manage the expectations. If you start paying out a profit to the employees, it's always worth managing the expectations and tiering that to a degree, because if an employee gets 10% on the first year, 10% of their salary is a profit, a dividend in the first year, they're going to expect 10% next year and the year after and the year after. So if it ever comes down based on market situations, based on coronavirus or something sadly hitting in a similar vein, you just need to manage those expectations quite well, and do not hang the fact that the business is employee owned purely on a profit share, because there are so many other advantages to it as well.
Completely agree, Oliver, completely agree. I've also had one come through around exit value. So do selling founders, owners selling to an EOT have to anticipate a lower exit valuation? And is there any data around how much that discount might typically be? So as I mentioned earlier, I think the sort of very high valuations that you might dream of in terms of a trade sale, I would honestly say that they're off the table. Those are not something I would anticipate going forward in terms of an employee ownership transaction. What we've got to consider is the valuation has got to be justifiable to the trustees. So it's got to make sense to them, and it's got to be something that can be maintained by the business, i.e. that those deferred payments or the debt to assist with those deferred payments has to be manageable. If we've got a crazy valuation and coming back to the debt point, and therefore they're laboured with the debt of the exit value, or we have a deferred tail that's 20 years long, that's not easily justifiable. There is a lot of flexibility around it, but typically I would say sort of when you do a valuation range, it will be at the lower end or the lower end of a range of multiples. But it's about what the company can facilitate as well, and what is justifiable. It's not to say that you can't achieve a good valuation, and of course the exiting shareholders still need to be rewarded for the work they put into the company. But what we've tended to find is that the people who are really interested in employee ownership transactions really believe in the legacy of the business and want to leave something for their employees to benefit from and work for, and actually part of that is making sure that they're passing on the business at a reasonable valuation and not stretching it to the upper echelons. It's not saying, you know, we take your valuation and we knock 50% off. It's not that at all. It can be a reasonable valuation, but it's just not at the upper ends of that. It's got to be justifiable and manageable. And
just to add to that, Anna-Louise, I think when you put into perspective, you're free from capital gains tax on that sale, then there's a balance for that. While your valuation might be lower than what a trade sale would do, you take away the fact you're not paying capital gains tax on it, then I think there's a medium that can be found. So, and actually the return for you as an owner or a founder is not significantly less than what it could be with a trade sale.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Oliver, and I think bearing in mind, depending on sort of size of the business, given entrepreneurs relief has been significantly reduced as well, I think that's kind of highlights even more the fact that, you know, it's not just benefit in terms of the valuation perspective as a kind of headline, it is that tax side of things as well if you're thinking about it. But again, I think the kind of bottom line and really key message is, you know, it isn't, as Anna-Louise said, you know, it's not the people who are looking at an EOT, it's not the driving force for why they're exploring that option. But there are a number of benefits over a period of time for departing shareholders that are really valuable.
One more item we've seen come in is, what is the average tail length? And this is a little bit, unfortunately, like how long is a piece of string, because it can alter completely based on the company and how big the exit value is they're hoping to achieve. Also, if you have a larger group of shareholders, different shareholders will have different needs, possibly different ages and different requirements of when they will retire. So if you have several shareholders exiting together, they don't need to have the same length tail. They can be paid in different over different time periods. You know, it could be that they're both paid over the first 3 years. One is fully paid out in that time, and another has another 4 years to go. It is up to you how long that tail is. Obviously, it's got to work for the exiting shareholders and work for the business. So I do think, you know, under 10 years needs to be targeted definitely, preferably less. But also, as I mentioned, there's not the legal obligation the same way, so these payments do flex. And actually, as Oliver's touched on, a lot of these businesses we find do it brilliantly, and therefore experiences I've had with businesses, they're paying out their tails more quickly than we had forecast. I hope that doesn't say something about our forecasting. I hope that just says how brilliant the businesses were. But they are being paid out more quickly, and that tail is shortening. So
I think actually that as well. That flexibility is really important. I think it's one where you contrast it to a trade sale where you might have a earn out period. You know, the likelihood of that being sort of different for you and versus the other exiting shareholder is highly unlikely, and that's much more a kind of those sorts of clauses in any transaction and structure are much more of a negotiation point rather than what I think here is very much a collaborative approach to make sure everyone around the table is in agreement. Sometimes it's kind of slightly less flexible in the other exit options we spoke about. But I think that's sort of all the questions that we've had through. We just had a few more come in actually. Let me just have a look.
I think we've got time for a couple more. One, John Lewis has always been the darling of the EO sector. Do their current problems demonstrate some of the issues for EO businesses when there is a need for significant change? And I think obviously the whole of that sector has struggled, so I don't know that it's necessarily just indicative of an EO business. Having said that, the way in which decisions are made in EO businesses tends to be more collaborative, and this can be brilliant because it considers a lot of opinions, but with anything, when there's a lot of opinions, it can slow down decision making. I'm not saying John Lewis are particularly slow at making decisions, but it is a risk of that sort of structure. And when you have more voices involved, it can be more difficult to be flexible and agile. But Oliver, I don't know if you want to step in here as well and add some thoughts.
Yeah, and far from a John Lewis spokesperson, but it depends how you measured their level of success or current situation. If it's based on the percentage of the profit share that goes to all the approximately 84,000 partners, then yes, it's decreased over recent years. But I think most employees would appreciate some kind of profit share, and John Lewis continued to do that, but seem to get some bad press when it's not 10% or 8%, 5 or 3%. But also as a business, they're looking to innovate. So where other organisations may look at their cash and their balance sheet and look at retaining that, what John Lewis are looking to do is where they can invest for innovation for the future. So the balance sheet may not look as strong as others, but that's because they're investing for the future as a long-term sustainable organisation. And the key is happiness and welfare of all the partners, and that's their main goal as an organisation, which they've done successfully for many, many years.
Thank you. I think we've got quite a few questions, so if we don't manage to answer it now, we will follow up with you or send round sort of a Q&A summary. An interesting one that's come through, which I've encountered in our advice, has been what would you say the pros and cons are with respect to management team incentivisation between a management buyout and an employee ownership trust? And with a management team, this is one of the challenges. So by becoming an employee ownership trust, at least if you become 100% employee ownership trust rather than a partial, the management team, sort of that top tier management who are not yet shareholders, will feel they may have lost the opportunity to become shareholders and realise that big capital value at the end. However, sort of the pro side of that is that they will get these distributions through their career, and this will probably happen sooner, given that there won't be other shareholders there with their dividends coming out. But it is a sorry, Oliver, do you want to?
Sorry, Annalise, once you've finished, in terms of employee ownership, you can have an EOT, employee ownership trust, but you can also have direct share ownership or a combination of the two. So you could, as an example, sell 80% of the shares to the EOT, retain 10% as a founder yourself, so you've still got an involvement, and 10% could be sold to the management team. So the management team could be incentivised by having a shareholding themselves. So there's a hybrid model of employee ownership that's available that really is an incentivising tool for managers.
yeah, there's actually all sorts. That's a good point, Oliver. There's a sort of many different options. You can have combined sort of shareholdings and employee ownership trust. There can be an EMI in there as well. There can be all sorts of different mechanisms to make sure everyone is maintaining that level of engagement that you need to make the business work. I don't know if we want to have we got time for any more? Are we about there?
I can see that last question just on the EOT and EMI. So I can just add a very quick point. So the question is, would it make sense to set EOT from the inception of the company? And would it be preferred to an EMI scheme if you can compare the two setups? Very quickly, what many organisations are looking at is setting up a hybrid model from the start. So setting up a trust, setting up that EMI scheme or direct share ownership from the very inception of becoming employee owned, because you've got greater flexibility and sustainability for the future. And whilst many advisors wouldn't want me to hear me say this, just pay your professional advisors once to set it up rather than paying them twice if later on down the line you want to change your setup.
Great, thanks, Oliver. I think then really we've got to the end of our time allotted today, and as you can probably tell, we can all talk non-stop, but we will tie it up there. We have got several questions, so what we'll do is we'll answer those that we haven't managed to get to in the time today, and then we'll circulate that and put online our responses along with the webinar. But thank you very much for joining us, and I hope it's been helpful in your thoughts on succession planning.
Yeah, I think if you haven't submitted or have it joined as anonymous and you do want to receive slides, recording, Q&A, etc., please pop your email address. We'll keep this kind of going for another minute. If you want to just keep the pop your email address in there just to make sure you get it, but otherwise, as Anne-Louise said, it will be online. Just a thanks very much to Oliver for joining us today. I think it's been really valuable to hear about EO directly from you and your experiences, and thanks to Anne-Louise as well for insight on actually affecting these transactions in real life. So thanks very much all, and if you've got any questions, kind of succession planning more generally, employee ownership specifically, both, do reach out to us. Our contact details are, I believe, on screen, but also we'll be circulating those when we send everything round. I think it's hopefully one of the areas we find where we can add the most value to our clients is, our sort of exit pathway program that we like to call it, but that's kind of just a formal way of saying that we're really here to help our clients along the way, and as is Oliver for employee ownership. So look forward to speaking to you guys soon and distributing those bits we mentioned. Have a great day.